You're listening to episode 69 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Roland Griffiths speaks with us about his work studying psilocybin's intersection with meditation. Many of our Buddhist centers here in the United States got their start and found practitioners in the psychedelic 60s. Literally, the culture of the time had an exploration of pharmacologicals, especially those which could produce altered perceptions of reality. Some have said these experiences led them to meditation, as it opened their minds, no joke intended, to possibilities such altered states suggested. Not all studies were scientific or particularly helpful. In a backlash from the Timothy Leary drug culture, much of the valid scientific work was shut down. It is only recently that some scientists are taking up this particular area of study again. Today's interview is particularly well timed, as only this week an article about these studies was released to the press. That article is linked on the episode page for this interview on the website. Dr. Roland Griffiths is a professor of behavioral biology, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and professor of neuroscience, Department of Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He has been given the Solvay Award for Outstanding Basic Psychopharmacological Research on Affective Disorders from the American Psychological Association, and the Brady-Schuster Award for Outstanding Behavioral Science Research in Psychopharmacology and Substance Abuse. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice iced tea. And I'm speaking with Dr. Roland Griffiths. Roland, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be with you, Ted.
Now, I wanted to start with part of our conversation that we were just having before starting the recording is about your work with substances and their effects on the mind. But let's start with your background, what your education is, how you first encountered meditation, and the study of the mind.
Well, let me back up even a little further than that to, in terms of the question about how I got into meditation and tell you just a little bit about my, initial upbringing. So I grew up in San Francisco Bay Area and my religious background was, Episcopal and United Church of Christ, but it really had no sincere meaning to me. In fact, I flunked out of confirmation class and didn't look back.
And it really just attendance is about it for that one.
It is. It was a very low threshold and I flunked, yeah. But that was a gauge of my disinterest. And then I went on to Occidental College and to your hometown, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, where I did my PhD in psychopharmacology, cross-disciplinary pharmacology and psychology. But while at Minnesota, I came upon a professor there, Arya, who was teaching meditation. And in spite of the fact that I was taking a lot of physiology and neuroscience and pharmacology, there was something that really was attractive to me about the idea behind meditation, that it just made sense from a scientific worldview that people could have possibly explored systematically the nature of mind and thought and interperceptual phenomena. And I was willing to excuse the what seemed to me at the time a very naive physiology that was described in the chakra systems and the nadis and what have you. So I was really curious in meditation, but as it turned out, it just didn't take. 3 minutes seemed like 3 hours. It was,
and no one listening to this podcast has ever had that experience in meditation.
It was painful, and so in spite of the fact that I was sympathetic to it, I simply dropped it. Went on with my graduate studies, and actually came directly out to Johns Hopkins, where I remain, and I'm presently a professor in the departments of psychiatry and neuroscience. So I came out here in 1972 and have been doing psychopharmacology research in animals and humans ever since. And this research is focused in on primarily mood-altering drugs, very often drugs of abuse, characterizing the subjective effects, the behavioral effects, and the physiological effects, with special emphasis on abuse liability differences between compounds. So then to fast forward about 15 years ago, I had a friend here in Baltimore who was involved with a Siddha Yoga meditation group in Baltimore, became intrigued by her descriptions of her retreat experiences and her unfolding interest in meditation and spirituality. And I tried again and went to a program at the Siddha Yoga Meditation Center. And this time something clicked. And I don't know why. I don't know if it was developmental on my part or the instruction set or, what have you. But it opened up this incredible window for me into a sense of awe and wonder about inner life and the nature of mind, and elements of spirituality that were deeply moving to me and got me reading all kinds of things on comparative religions and comparative meditation traditions, because partly I wanted to figure out what the hell had happened to me. And did I need to, by hook, line, and sinker, what I was being told from this one tradition, or was there more generality to this? And so it got me very curious about the nature of those kinds of questions. And in the course of that, it also altered my worldview, in that it really reshifted this core sense of self that I had, I guess, for most of my life, defined myself on the basis of that little inner voice that told me to do things and told me what it thought. And that's who I thought I was.
You were being led by the homunculus in your head.
Yeah, I was. And, and one of the, I hesitate to use the word sad, but in fact, I very much defined myself with material accomplishments. And in this case, my research career was important to me. My family was important to me. I was very focused on that. But in a sense, after getting involved with meditation, there was a much bigger story of interest to me. And I started wondering actually what I was doing in my work in psychopharmacology, what was so compelling about, yet another set of studies investigating abuse liability of compounds, sedatives or stimulants or what have you. So there was a little period of time where I was had my feet in two worlds. One was I was exploring meditation traditions and spirituality, and one I was continuing to be in the world as I had been accustomed to living in it. And then I, by a number of coincidences, got reintroduced to the whole idea in the literature from the 1960s that some of these classic hallucinogen compounds can occasion experiences that look very similar to spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, if you will. And so that idea was immediately intriguing to me, because it seemed to me that it would be an excuse to go in and start reading the about comparative religions, to read about what people in the psychology of religion had been doing in this area, and that was a literature that was, totally unknown to me, and see if we could mount a study to examine some of the effects of a classic hallucinogen. So let me now just describe what the classic hallucinogens are for your audience.
So mainly for me with no experience, please.
So the classic hallucinogens are a set of compounds that primarily bind serotonin 5-HT2A receptors. That's their primary mode of action, although different compounds have activity at other receptor sites. And the prototypes of that class are drugs like LSD, which is, as you know, a synthetic compound. But there are a number of compounds like psilocybin from the hallucinogenic psilocybin mushroom, and mescaline from the peyote cactus, and DMT from ayahuasca, which is a plant admixture that's used in South America. And all three of those, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT, are used sacramentally within some cultures for religious or spiritual purposes. So there's actually a long tradition of thousands of years that go back, and that's probably best documented with psilocybin, that go back, that shows that these drugs have been used for long periods within some cultures in very structured manner for divinatory or spiritual purpose. So that fits with the story that was told in the 1960s when these drugs came under study for a period of just over a decade or two, about the possibility that they could occasion experiences that might have spiritual meaning. And so I was doing comparative pharmacology research and had a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse to study actually a different kind of hallucinogen, ketamine, which is not a serotonergically mediated compound. And we switched the study and decided to look at psilocybin instead, and mounted a comparative pharmacology study to see whether or not psilocybin could occasion meaningful experiences of a spiritual type. And I would have to say, well, there are a couple things. One, in undertaking the study, it was a long shot because these drugs had actually not been studied for almost 30 years in the United States, and certainly that long in people without histories of any prior exposure. And this was just because of what happened in the 1960s and the demonization of these compounds, and the after bad actors like Timothy Leary so undermined a methodical scientific approach to studying these compounds. And for a period of decades, it was simply thought that these drugs were too dangerous to study in humans. And so we looked carefully at that literature and decided that that needn't be the case, and we made arguments to our IRB, that's our ethical board at Hopkins, and to the Food and Drug Administration that also has to approve these kinds of protocols. And they weighed the risks and benefits, and credit to Hopkins, they concluded that we should proceed with this study. There are lots of safety measures built into it. So we proceeded, and this was about 2000 that we got final approval to launch our first study, and it was conducted in volunteers who were healthy, normal volunteers, and had no history of prior exposure to any of the classic hallucinogens. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One is that we didn't want to bias our subject group coming into the study and select only those people who had had positive experiences with these compounds, because someone who had had a negative experience obviously probably wouldn't volunteer for a study of this sort. And we also thought that bringing in naive volunteers would increase the likelihood that we could blind the study effectively. And we went through a number of procedures to blind people, to keep them confused about the nature of what was being administered. And I won't go into those details unless you want me to. But in fact, everyone knew that they were going to get some dose of psilocybin at some point over 2 or 3 sessions, but they were blinded to other drugs that could be administered, doses that could be administered. And in fact, what we did in our first study is just compare a pretty high dose of Ritalin, methylphenidate, a stimulant, with psilocybin. But people had all kinds of other ideas about what they might get, including, I should say, the monitors who prepared the volunteers for the sessions and were with them throughout the session. So
to me, that's terrific to hear, because what you just described, and this is one of the things that I, as a science-minded person, as a skeptic, want to see double-blinded studies. And what you just described is exactly what good science is, when you have not only controls on the potential placebo effects and expectations and confirmation biases of the people in the study, but those of the people administering it. That when you're looking at the data, you're actually looking at controlled good data.
Yes, well, thank you for that comment. And there's still limitations in the double blinding, because people knew they were going to get psilocybin at some point, but never having experienced psilocybin, they didn't know what that would feel like, and because they thought they could get a variety of other drugs. Yeah, so that was the nature of the blind. Well, so and the study, I might add, also was designed just to be a straight up comparative pharmacology study, because I personally was not convinced that psilocybin would necessarily produce anything that was going to be of interest certainly at the level that I was experiencing experiences through my own meditation practice, which at that point was a stable and very nourishing practice to me. So I came into this study in some ways really quite agnostic with respect to outcome, and I was fine if the study didn't show anything very interesting. That was okay. I had my meditation practice. I had no intention of abandoning that, and so I didn't come in as an advocate. Well, the bottom line of the study is that most people in the study ended up having experiences that really match on to what has been called historically the primary mystical experience. That's an experience that's been described by mystics and other people throughout the ages, and it's and there's a established phenomenology of that experience, and I'll describe that in just a second. And these experiences can be very life-altering. And the majority of our volunteers had experiences of that type. So So let me just say something about the nature of the mystical experience. So it's been described now very well by people in the psychology of religion, starting, incidentally, with William James, the famous American psychologist, back in 1902 when he wrote in Varieties of Religious Experience and talked about the nature of mystical experience. And then other authors, and one in particular, William Stace, back in 1960, really developed a very nice phenomenological description of these altered states. And then subsequently the people in the psychology of religion started working with them and have developed sets of questionnaires that assess these kinds of experience. And Ralph Hood in particular developed a questionnaire called the Mysticism Scale that is really designed to measure spontaneously occurring or naturally occurring mystical type experiences. So what are the features of these experiences? So the hallmark feature of the mystical experience is the sense of unity, sense of the interconnectedness of all people and all things, a sense that all is one. Sometimes can be described as the void. Sometimes can be described as a merging or interconnectedness with all people and things. Sometimes described as a sense of the aliveness of all things. So that's kind of the core experience, and that's accompanied by a sense of sacredness or deep reverence, a noetic quality, a sense that the experience is more true and more real than everyday waking consciousness. There's an authority to the experience that actually accounts for why the memory of the experience is sustained with such fidelity. The other features of the experience are positive mood, very often a sense of heart opening, love, universal love, peace, tranquility, a sense of transcendence of time and space, so time collapses into the present moment, and future and past disappear. Space becomes vast, infinitely vast. And the final quality of these experiences are they're ineffable at their core. So one of the first things that people who have an experience of this sort say is, I can't possibly put that into words. And so using Hood scale that had been developed to assess these naturally occurring experiences, we showed that psilocybin produced experiences of this type in a high proportion of our volunteers. Now, I might back up. There was one study, and a very important study done in 1962 by Walter Pankey, who was a minister and doing a PhD thesis at Harvard, who gave psilocybin to 20 divinity students on Good Friday, during a Good Friday service. And there were many limitations of that study, but his conclusions were not were essentially in line with ours. But he did it as a group study with a lot of confounding of expectancy in it. So in one sense, for those people who had this view of the possibility of psilocybin, we were simply replicating the Pankey study. From where I sat, as essentially a skeptic and a disbeliever, I was kind of, blown away by it. Now, so what was it that impressed me? Well, I would go into people after each session and I would interview them, so what, tell me about what happened. And very often the first thing that they would say is, I can't tell you. I can't possibly put it into words. And I would think to myself, okay, that's, checklist 1. I got that one right. And then kind of haltingly, I would be speaking to what I felt was a newly minted mystic. They were grasping for metaphor and for descriptive phrasing to describe this indescribable. And very often, as they put it in their own words, these features of the primary mystical experience would come out, and they would say, a sense of interconnectedness, love. It was sacred, and a deep sense of knowing. Very often they would say it's a homecoming. I've been here before. I knew this was true. I knew this was true all along. And this just confirms what I know to be true. Now, I guess I failed to mention that we did recruit in people into the study who had active interest in spirituality. We have not conducted this study in atheists or people who would be closed to a worldview that would not allow any interest in a sensibility of what we call sacred. And that incidentally is a very interesting study to run. So one of the most compelling things about the study was not so much, so we had this phenomenology. They all reported this experience. Okay, that's nice, and they said it was interesting and important. What really was remarkable to me is 2 months after sessions, we would then bring them back in and interview them again and take some more data from them. And this was prior to another session. They ended up with 2 or 3 sessions over the course of the study. And the first few volunteers we had come in, I'd say, well, when you think back about it, tell me about the experience. And they would say essentially it was one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And I would say, well, what does that mean? Thinking that these were, well, and I guess I should say too that the volunteers as a group were a group of high functioning, very competent, highly educated people. So most had, I think over half had postgraduate degrees. Most were employed full time, as professionals. We had ministers and psychologists and nurses and business owners. So this was a group of high functioning people. But when they said this is among the most meaningful of their lives, I was thinking maybe they've led pretty sheltered lives. But then they would compare it literally to you and say, it's when my eldest child was born, that changed my life forever. And they say, recently my father passed away, and that was huge for me. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. And when I heard stories like this, we actually ended up developing another questionnaire, asking them to rate on a scale from like an everyday experience to the most significant experience of their life, what this experience was. And we've had people now complete those questionnaires at either 1 or 2 months after experiences, and then 14 months later, over a year later. And the remarkable feature of that is that most people are saying it's at least in the top 5 most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. In our first study, about 30% of these already spiritually inclined people said it was the single most meaningful spiritually experience, or single most spiritually significant experience of their life. So clearly, this experience has authority and meaning to them that is unlike anything I've seen. So I've been doing, this psychopharmacology research in humans for, almost 40 years now at Hopkins. I've worked with a whole variety of different kinds of classes of drugs. I'm accustomed to talking to people about drug effects and their thoughts about drug effects. And never have I seen something that, what makes this so unusual, it's informing the individual going forward in time. So you ask someone after they've been drunk, what what was that experience like? And it's in memory. Well, I got drunk and we, played games or whatever. And if it informs them going forward, it's only maybe, I'm never going to drink, shots of tequila again.
Right. It's not as fundamentally transformative. It was it was great at the time, but now that I look back, not so much. And what's striking me as several things about what you're saying is that you yourself in meditation were finding that the experiences that you had just in meditation were fundamentally different and seemingly in contrast with your other work, which is very scientific and grounded in hard facts and evidence. And suddenly there was an experiential event which lent an energy and a passion and an interest. And one of the things that we as science-minded people and skeptics are often misinterpreted as being is that we suck all the interest and the wonder and the joy out of things, and it's not that at all. These are not incompatible at all in the least. And in particular, you approaching the work with psilocybin as from a more skeptical viewpoint, not believing necessarily this would have quite an impact, and having, as you just said, many, many years of experience with these substances and how they affected people and how they would report it. This was something that has carried meaning forward, and that is something I have heard in speaking with others about this substance and others, is that they can really help expand one's awareness of the possibilities of one's interconnectedness. And it's important to note that this is a perception that we have. This is in a mind state, and that's okay, that it has a positive transforming effect in one's life to happiness, to joy, towards looking out for the other as much as we look out for ourselves. And again, as you're saying, many months later, there's still a reference to that as, yes, this was one of the most important things that has happened to me. That we term them mystical experiences. And as you and I were chatting earlier, we sometimes get gummed up a little bit on our terminology, but that doesn't mean necessarily, we tend to take it, but doesn't always mean supernatural. That's not what we're talking about. This is induced by a biological reaction to a substance that is introduced into the body. This is perfectly natural. But there's still an experience out of it that one takes and is transformative in their lives. So based on some of that, what are some of the therapeutic directions that this can take people? What are you looking at for this?
Well, let me just back up to the mystical experience. So the fact is that this experience was occasioned under these very predetermined sets of conditions where people had they had preparation. They'd been highly selected. They were. I did mention the context in which it was given. It was given to people who came in for a session day. They reclined on a couch. They had eye shades on and headphones through which they listened to classical music. They were instructed to direct their attention inward on their inner experience, and they were in the presence of two monitors with whom they had a trusting relationship, so they felt they could surrender to the experience. But the core features of that experience map on one for one with this so-called spontaneously occurring mystical experience. And so scientifically, the exciting piece of that is that these mystical experiences have been described, for millennia, by people who have come upon them and had and interpret them, however. But they haven't been amenable to prospective scientific study. All we can do is, up until this point, is interview those people who have these experiences and learn about the nature of those experiences. But we really can't study the conditions that occasion those experiences or what their consequences are. With psilocybin as a model system now, we can prospectively study the nature of these experiences. And so that, to me, as a scientist, I mean, like a kid in a candy shop, there are a million ways to go with this. So we can now do reductive neuroscience kinds of studies to look at where in brain, what areas are activated under these kinds of conditions. We can look at pharmacological interaction, what kind of antagonists and what other neurophysiological systems are activated during these experiences. We can also ask questions about, from the realm of biological psychiatry, what personality variables, what setting conditions are important to producing these kinds of experiences. Are there genetic predispositions that increase the likelihood of these experiences? But even if those are active, most people have these experiences under these kinds of setting conditions. And then, and then the whole question about how do these experiences occur to experiences that arise, say, from meditation, so phenomenological comparisons. And then what's the consequences of these experiences? How do they play out in someone's life, over time? And so those are all, valid sets of questions that can be asked. And one of the horrendously frustrating, so being a scientist interested in this, is NIH is still reacting to the demonization of these compounds from the 1960s and has not funded a single clinical trial, these kinds of compounds yet. And I'm absolutely convinced that's going to change. It's far too interesting and important to not fund this research at some point. And you asked about future directions. There are a number of different directions that we're going. So we've done systematic replications and dose effect comparisons with psilocybin in healthy volunteers. And then recently we've undertaken a very interesting study that would be of interest to your listening audience, I'm sure, that we're looking at this intersection between psilocybin and meditation. And here we're taking in, for the study that we're currently enrolling, which is only open to people local in the Baltimore community and Washington community, we're taking in people who are interested in initiating a meditation practice but don't have an established practice, and who are curious about the effects of psilocybin, and we're looking for the synergy, the potential synergy between the two. And my thought about that is that meditation and psilocybin are similar to the extent that they're both ways of exploring the nature of consciousness, or the nature of mind, if you will. And I sometimes think of meditation as the slow shore, long course in the nature of mind, and that's what we learn in meditation is how our minds work, and I think of psilocybin in some respects as a crash course in the nature of mind. That some of the truths that emerge from meditative experiences are also the same truths that emerge from psilocybin. So under the effects of the drug, people recognize that they are not their minds. uh, that that there is a sense of interconnectedness of all things, and that there's very substantial information that can be forthcoming if one looks deeply into the nature of mind and the phenomena that arise. And so in that study, we're looking at how psilocybin might facilitate engagement with meditation practices, and then a whole variety of other kinds of dispositional tendencies toward forgiveness and gratitude and pro-social kinds of behavior. Another study that's in the planning stage that would be of interest to your listener audience is that in collaboration with Richie Davidson, we are planning a study of the effects of psilocybin in long-term established meditators, and we're still writing the protocol and haven't finally decided on what the parameters of definition of a long-term meditator is going to be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're thinking that the longer the better, and the more established the better. So years, if not decades, of daily meditation practice and substantial retreat practice. And there we're interested in determining what the nature of these experiences are from the perspective of someone who is highly trained in terms of self-observation, and whether that importantly informs their meditation practice going forward. And with Richie Davidson, we'll do a number of neuroimaging measures with fMRI to assess some of the variables that he's shown differentiate long-term Tibetan meditators from novice meditators. So it's and in the study we'll also look at the effects of low-dose psilocybin on different forms of meditation, like shamatha versus open awareness practice in loving kindness. So there's there's a lot to be done there, and it's very exciting.
Well, that in particular to hear about is exciting, because one of the comments that I've frequently had from a number of people on the discussions on the Facebook page is folks have said, there are lots of studies about people who are a particular type of meditator, but we haven't really seen, and maybe there have been, and I just haven't run across them yet, studies of what's happening in the brain when we're doing this type of meditation, experienced meditators of that type, versus another kind of meditation. Because what we've been describing is very much in the classic sense, a jhana, a samatha kind of meditation, as opposed to a very active mind, mindfulness kind of meditation. The effects that you're describing are ones that are very much people who are long-term meditators are very familiar with. I also find it interesting that this is particularly well timed. We're recording this at the moment when I have just published episode 65, which is an interview with Richie Davidson of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. So to hear that there is collaboration in the works is wonderful to hear, and my hope personally for that upcoming study is that it's not limited to one area, that the rest of us in other parts of the country could maybe participate in it. But I know that's a challenge.
Yeah, and we haven't made that determination yet, whether we will try to recruit simply locally or whether we'll go nationally. We may need to go nationally to get the kinds of people that we want into the study.
Now, Roland, you also mentioned another study that you're looking for people to participate in, having to do with cancer. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Ted. Actually, we have there are a couple therapeutic targets that bring themselves forward as potential applications for psilocybin or related compounds. one is cancer, one is the addictions, and I'll tell you about both. The cancer study is the furthest along. Again, pulling on research done back in the 1960s, there was some interest that experiences of the type that I'm describing, the meaningful spiritual experiences, would be of therapeutic benefit to individuals who were struggling with anxiety or depression secondary to their cancer diagnosis. This is essentially the existential crisis of facing one's personal demise. And so very recently, Charlie Grove at UCLA has published a pilot study with psilocybin in 12 cancer patients. Our group at Johns Hopkins and a group at NYU have ongoing studies. We're looking at higher doses of psilocybin than Charlie Grove gave. And although the study is blinded, we've run about 20 volunteers to date, but we have to recruit in 44. But our study's been open for over 3 years, so enrollment has been incredibly slow. And you've mentioned that you're a cancer survivor, so you can probably empathize and have insight into this. There are a couple reasons for this. One is the oncology community is so focused on cure and so not knowledgeable about something like psilocybin that they've been reluctant to refer into this protocol. And secondly, with great sympathy and empathy for the cancer patients, they have been put through a lot. And the last thing in the world they're looking for is the opportunity to do another clinical trial and come in for evaluation. And this in our study is extensive with respect to the evaluation and the screening. But what I can say is that the people who have participated nationally, most of our people have actually flown in from out of state, although now we have a travel grant program so we can pay at least partially pay their travel costs in. What I can say is the results appear to be mapping on to those that we got in healthy volunteers. People are having these deeply moving experiences, and it can be completely transformative to their worldview. This sense of this interconnectedness of all people and things is profound, and we've seen some very touching cases where people have had these sessions and been so uplifted by them that they end up going home and giving support to their caretakers. They're the ones who are saying, I'm really sad to be leaving, but it's okay. And at some level, it's okay. And you just have to let me go. And when you hear that from someone who formerly was incredibly anxious and their family was caught up in this grasping for life and the new alternative therapy. And when you hear that kind of reflective transformation about it's okay, it's sad, but it's okay, and at some level, I'm going to be just fine, And it's beautiful, actually.
It is, and it's a tremendous contrast, as you were saying, that in my own experience, I'm one of the long-term meditators, and the news of my own cancer diagnosis, and bear in mind, every male member of my family who's gotten colon cancer has not survived. So this is essentially our historical perspective in my clan is, here's your death sentence, have a nice day. And the time that I got this, and bear in mind my brother had passed away 2 years before from this, so it was very fresh in my family's mind. I received this news when coming out of a 10-day retreat with Bhante Gunaratana at Bhavana Society in West Virginia. And so, of course, you come out of a retreat, particularly there, because this is a wonderful place to do retreats. You're in your happy place. It's kind of a general common way of saying that the mind is very settled. You're very calm. And in particular, having a long meditation practice, this is a very stable place. And so on the way back to the airport, getting the 9 messages on my cell phone when I turned it on, many of them from Hubert Humphrey Cancer Center, from the doctor, saying, oh, you have to come in right away, it's cancer, and jumping up and down, very excited. And just setting off the phone and understanding what this probably meant, and nonetheless taking a very, very nice and pleasant walk in a park across the street from where we were waiting at a gas station on the way back to the airport at the time, and not really having this be a terribly upsetting thing is a much, much nicer way to be able to interact with this kind of news than what I read in a journal that was set out, a very compassionate and wonderful idea, I think, for people at Hubert Humphrey Cancer Center here in Minnesota. They have a little book set out for people to write whatever they want, and they're there for cancer treatments. And I looked through that book, and most of it was from the perspective of the person who had cancer and was struggling with treatments and all the effects therein. And they were not a reaction of, what a lovely park, and let's take a walk. They were reactions of anxiety and stress and physical pain and what we would traditionally speak of as dukkha, as suffering. And that there can be a therapeutic change in one's approach to the same news that people are getting and the same kinds of treatments that people endure is a wonderful opportunity for this area of research. And I encourage you in your work in continuing with that, because not all people will have that long-standing meditation practice that's already in place to help them deal with the stresses of very big, life-changing news items like that. So good for you. Please continue.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for that. And you know, those in the journal the journal entries that you described really are reflective of how our culture deals with death and dying, and it's horrendous. And I would wish for the whole culture that we had a culture of meditators, but we don't. And to the extent that psilocybin and meditation are both training in the nature of mind and some of the implications of that, it's, you know, a crash course is better than no course at all.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on it very well just now. We don't have a culture of meditators. We have a very, at least in the West, a fairly self-absorbed culture. Is one way I would describe it. And having that openness and that interconnectivity and the change that you described with some of the cancer patients of it's going to be okay, and being caregivers for their families and loved ones, that is a place where I would like to see society and culture in general go to concern for others, because that is a place of happiness and calm, not stress and anxiety.
Yes. So if you'll allow me just to mention my website to your listeners. So the website for the study, if you know of anyone who might be interested, or you know of anyone who might know of someone who would be interested, the website is www.cancer-insight.org. And from that website, there's a video and there's information about a partial travel grant reimbursement program that we have. and would love to continue to enroll volunteers in this study. So if you know of anyone, please let us know.
Roland, with the study that you just mentioned, there's certain criteria that you're looking for. Tell us about that.
Well, the detailed criteria are, of course, available on the website, but just briefly, volunteers should be between 21 and 70 years old. They can have they should have a cancer diagnosis that's potentially life-threatening, but patients with and without disease progression are eligible. So it's not necessarily just end-stage disease. So if someone has been treated and is having continuing anxiety and it's been over a year since their treatment, they would be eligible for admission. And the one exclusion criteria is that if there's CNS brain involvement, then we're not allowed to enroll people.
Mm-hmm. And that would make sense because that's part of what the study itself is.
Right. Psilocybin works through the CNS. So,
Roland, you also mentioned another therapeutic avenue is addictions, and I'm very interested in hearing about that because we've had a number of podcast episodes on programs for people who are suffering from addiction. So I am very interested to hear about some of the therapeutic opportunities for that as well.
Well, that's this again comes out of the research done in the 1960s that looked primarily at the use of these classic hallucinogens in treatment of alcoholism and a few studies in drug abuse. The results of that literature were equivocal. The studies weren't designed entirely satisfactorily and certainly not to today's standards. But the thought here is that could a mystical experience of the type that we've already discussed alter someone's relationships in addictions. And so one interesting thing is if you look at the history of addictions, very often people will report spontaneous abstinence based on a spontaneously occurring mystical type experience or epiphany, if you will. And probably the most famous example of that is Bill Wilson, founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who had an experience of enlightenment, he might describe it as, when he was undergoing DTs from an alcohol withdrawal. And on the basis of that, he founded the whole Alcoholics Anonymous movement. And if you look at the 12 steps, about half, I think it's 6 of the 12 steps, involve surrendering to higher power or acknowledging one's lack of control and needing to surrender to something larger than oneself, which is the core piece of the mystical experience. So the thought is that people who have these kinds of experiences might be able to engage in AA or other kinds of therapeutic modalities more effectively. And in this regard, we have initiated a pilot study here at Johns Hopkins in cigarette smokers. We've treated 4 smokers to date. All remain abstinent. 2 are now past a year, 1 past 6 months, 1 has only been a couple weeks out. But there may be something here. We're looking at psilocybin in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy, and the understanding here is that psilocybin may enhance self-efficacy at a very core level. And we'll see. We certainly need to collect more data, but the approach appears promising. There are other academic centers in the country that are initiating studies of psilocybin and alcoholism. So stay tuned.
I will, and it's interesting to hear about that, and in particular the way you were describing the 12-step program. We had in episode 56, we interviewed Kevin Griffin, who is the author of a couple of books. The one in particular we were talking about at that time was A Burning Desire, Dharma, God, and the path of recovery. And in particular, we were talking about that higher power piece of it, because there's a reflexive tendency within atheists and often skeptic groups to automatically put that into the traditional 12-step program is a Judeo-Christian framework of the Judeo-Christian God. Not necessarily so, that there are other ways to look at this in which it's simply these are things you can't control. That is very much a valid approach to treatment in one's therapeutic approach to an addiction recovery. So it's interesting to hear that there are some potentials for what you're studying in that as well, that may have impact to how we approach the higher power.
Yeah, and let me just underscore the point you're making there. So this mystical experience isn't necessarily an experience of an encounter with higher power per se, but there's an unknown and also and indeed for some people it is, depending on their mindset. But for other people, there's this sense of this interconnectedness of all things, the undergirding fabric of life and reality that is awesome, and and we lack words that can describe this very adequately. But you certainly don't have to have any kind of theistic belief to have that experience and be moved by that experience.
Exactly, and nor do we as non-believers need to reject the experience, because really that's what we're talking about, is that there is an experience. It is happening to a person. The conclusions we draw are a separate matter that people take into their own hands. They draw their different conclusions, and that's fine. Sometimes that's a very positive thing. Sometimes it's not so much. But the fact remains that there is an experience, and that can be personally transformative, because the experience itself changes the way we look at things, and that's where the transformation comes in.
Yes, and let me say one of the most interesting implications of our work with psilocybin, that we can occasion these experiences with very high probability. In our last study, over 70% of people had a full mystical experience. The implication of that, to me, is that these experiences are biologically normal. That is, we as human organisms are wired to have these kinds of experiences. It's part of our biology. And so it makes sense that they've occurred spontaneously under certain conditions, and maybe they're genetic predispositions or other kinds of factors. But this is completely appears to be completely part of how we're put together.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then you can get into the philosophical question about, well, why? And there are material and non-material approaches to the answer to that. But that's philosophy as far as I'm concerned. The fact is that the experience occurs. It's biologically normal, and it's reorganizational of the human condition when it occurs. And what I would argue is that it's foundational to the ethical and moral codes that have been developed, by our species cross-culturally. If you look at the core ethical moral traditions and what they say about do unto others as you would have them do unto you, this interconnectedness of all people and things, that's it. So we're talking about something fundamentally important. We don't have to get caught up on the philosophical or theological implications of it. It's a matter of science.
Yeah, having a naturalistic explanation for what's happening does not in any way, shape, or form take away from the importance and meaningfulness and positive impacts these experiences can have.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, and I'm actually looking at that website right now, and there are very good resources about that, including information about how the study works, who should volunteer, what is psilocybin, and the facilities, all of it. It's a really terrific opportunity for those who are struggling, because this is, of course, not happy news. This is very hard, and it's not just hard on the person who has cancer. It's hard on everyone in their lives, and there are probably very few listeners here who have not in some way been touched by cancer, by someone they may know, a loved one, they themselves. So I do urge you to go out to that site. Let me read that again. The location is www.cancer-insight.org. And we've been speaking with Dr. Roland Griffiths, Professor of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Roland, thank you so much for being here. I'm very, very glad to have spent this time with you today.
It's been a great pleasure for me, Ted. Thank you, and thank you for your great work with the Secular Buddhist.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.